welcome to this quick hit episode of the Guns Magazine podcast. I'm your host and the editor of Guns Magazine, Brent Wheat. Today, I'm joined by American Handgunner magazine editor, Tom McHale. Hey, Tom.
Hey, Brent. How you doing?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I talked to Roy Huntington, our boss and the publisher of both Handgunner and Guns Magazine. We talked about church security. That podcast episode attracted a lot of attention from listeners. I found out Tom is a working member of an active church security team, so I thought we could get together and get some of his insights on church security. Tom, church security is obviously a hot topic, especially on the heels of that incident in Texas. Roy and I discussed in our earlier show, it's not just about grabbing a bunch of your CCW buddies and calling yourself the cavalry. So tell us a little bit about your team and how it all got started.
Yeah, it's a great point, I think, that you just made, getting a bunch of people with guns together and calling the job done. The real value in creating something like that, I think, is in being able to manage the day-to-day stuff.
Yeah.
You know, we do want to prepare for the unlikely, hopefully very unlikely scenarios that may happen and do happen in some cases. But I think it's really important to take a giant step back and think about why you're there. You know, in our case, we've been doing this for years now. I've been leading the team at our fairly large church for, 2-3 years. And we've just taken a very holistic approach to this whole thing.
And that was kind of what we talked about on the idea of this is a safety team, and church security is only one facet of having a safety team. And that also makes it a little more palatable, because in a church, I mean, you know, the mission of carrying guns and dealing with bad guys is a little bit uncomfortable when juxtaposed against the idea of a church should be a welcoming, calm, peaceful, serene kind of place.
And I tell you, I'd like to back up a step to that word you use. Use the word safety instead of security. And we actually do that too. We call ours the safety team. And that's because it consists of two parts. We do have a security half, but we also have a medical half. And to us, those two things get equal attention because medical incidents will happen. You know, these are the things that when you gather 1,000 or 2,000 people together week after week after week, you are going to have medical situations. I mean, thankfully, most of ours are wasp stings and, dented foreheads in the preschool area when they run into doorknobs and such. But you're going to have incidents, and sometimes serious ones. You're going to have heart attacks, you're going to have strokes, you're going to have fainting, you're going to have low blood sugar issues, all of these things. So it's really important to not say, hey, we're just here to stop, mass shootings and that kind of thing. You know, if you take a holistic approach, you can cover a whole host of scenarios.
So when you guys were starting a team, how do you deal with the fallout, if you want to call it political or social fallout? Because not everybody, especially in a large church like that, is going to support the idea of having armed people in the congregation.
Well, that's where the holistic approach came into play. We were blessed to have a gentleman on our team who ran base security for the Air Force for 20, 25 years, right? So when you look at a situation like that, sure, they're worried about somebody driving through the gates and doing something violent, but they really have to step back and say, okay, what are the things that can impact the mission of this base? And in our case, what are the things that can hurt the mission of the church as a whole? And we went through this whole, I guess you'd call it a risk analysis process, right? To say, what can stop this church from functioning? And it's not just a mass shooter event. You know, it could be a whole laundry list of things. And this gentleman actually helped us go through this process where we ranked, likelihood of something happening versus the severity of its impact. And we literally applied math to these things. So you end up with this big grid that says, okay, here are the types of incidents that we think could possibly happen here. Here are the likelihood of them happening, and here's the impact, of each one of those things. And based on that, we actually are able to come back to church leadership with a very well thought out plan that said, okay, these are the types of things that can impact the mission of the church, right? Here's what we want to do about them. And that's a very different conversation than walking in the door saying, okay, we've got to arm a bunch of people and roam around the parking lot and look for suspicious individuals.
Yeah.
So, one, we feel better that we're doing a good job of evaluating, identifying, and mitigating risk as a whole. Two, leadership sees that as well. they can step back and say, wow, they're really looking out for, the benefit of the church holistically. I keep using that word, but it's very, very important in this process.
Did the impetus, the push for this come from within the congregation, or was it the leadership, or did everybody kind of arrive at the same spot at the same time?
That's a good question. I came onto the scene a little bit later. There was a less formal, version of the program before I got involved. So I really couldn't say what started it. My understanding that it was kind of a common sense thing. It said, hey, anytime you've got a large group of people gathered in one place, you're essentially a small town,
right?
And no one bats an eye about a small town having, emergency staff or emergency resources on standby, whether it be medical, security, or both.
So how do you guys go about recruiting and selecting team members?
Well, for this conversation, we can kind of focus on the security side. The medical stuff is very straightforward, right? We have EMTs and docs and nurses and, those type of folks. But on the safety side, we look first and foremost for heart and passion for the job at hand. There are some people that, are willing to step up and have that, I don't know, maybe you'd call it a spiritual gift of protection. Mm-hmm. They want to volunteer their time and effort to make sure that others can come there and worship in safety. Right. So looking back at who our very best volunteers have been, they've been those folks. We do have some active police officers. We have some active military. We also have probably 50% pure civilian. And, now it's a whole different question when we get to the point of who carries guns and who doesn't. We can get there in a minute. That's a different conversation. But, I'm just talking people that are going to step up, be eyes and ears, and kind of keep their eyes open for what's going on around the property.
That the next step would be training. What kind of training? And again, we're talking on the security side of things. What kind of training do you guys do, both initially and ongoing?
Well, we the first part of that is maybe we should start with the armed and unarmed distinction. We're pretty rigorous about that. In South Carolina, where I live, the state does not allow concealed carry in churches unless there's explicit permission from the church to an individual. So the fact that you have a concealed carry permit means nothing. Mm-hmm. The only people that can carry on church property without explicit permission are active duty law enforcement, federal, local, state. So concealed carry doesn't fly. But that's okay, because for our team, that's not enough anyway.
Yeah.
I won't speak for all concealed carry training programs, but most of them across the country are teaching laws, they're teaching concepts, they're teaching, when you can legally shoot and when you can't. That's not near enough for a church to issue, quote unquote, permission to carry in a crowded, chaotic environment, right? I mean, you saw with that recent video that when something goes bad, you're thinking about a volunteer drawing a gun and firing in a room full of, how big is your church? 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000 people. Right.
And they're all screaming and running and going 42 different directions at the same time.
Exactly. So, coming back to your question, I think the very first step in our quote unquote training program is the process that we use to get to that point of issuing permission for a volunteer to carry a gun. Right. So what we look for is, the law enforcement side is easier because a lot of that is built in. But on the civilian side, carry permit is required, but we also require extra above and beyond defensive shooting and defensive tactics training.
Right.
Whether somebody's done classes like that at one of the national schools or regional school or some other quality organization, that's the kind of stuff we require before we get to that point. Now, we also kind of use standard certifications. In our case, we use the current, I think it was revised in 2019, FBI qualification. That's not a training program, but that is somewhat of a certification or punctuation mark, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a widely recognized skill test.
Yeah. And, on the liability side, that's something nice for us to say. It's like, hey, we do allow carry on the property, but anybody who carries has to go through the exact same qualification process that active duty FBI agents do. And that provides a lot of comfort. Going back to one of your early questions about how do people feel about that? Well, that goes a long way in mitigating some of the fear and uncertainty.
Now, I assume you guys have policies and procedures. How in depth do you get into that? And that's one of those things that it's not glamorous and it's not cool, of loading up your gun and running and gunning on the range, but it's as critical to what you're doing. How extensive do you get into that?
Pretty extensive. Earlier I talked about our risk assessment process and how we came up with a list of about a dozen types of scenarios that we decided are most that we should care about, right? And that ranges from anything to a suspicious backpack sitting in a hallway to a domestic dispute to a lost child to an active shooter to, you name it, right?
Yeah.
For each of those scenarios, we've gone through and we've identified kind of a checklist, right, of procedures. Here's what's got to happen in each of those cases. Now, in our case, we've got the luxury, I guess, of having a pretty comprehensive camera system. So we have somebody who can kind of be that brain and walk the team through those pre-planned responses, should those types of things happen.
Well, it sounds like you guys have taken this real seriously and done it by the numbers.
Well, you know where active shooter is on our ranked scenario list?
Probably pretty low.
It's number 7.
Yeah.
We get really good at the things that can and will happen repeatedly. Just when you have that many people together, things are going to happen. And that's great practice. Something more serious ever comes to pass. We've worked out a lot of kinks on group communication and who does what and process and all of these things. So,
and teamwork is so critical in any of these situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I was reading something not too long ago, and just going back to my own experience as law enforcement, the biggest problem a lot of times is domestic problems because people bring their problems to church, and it doesn't make the headlines unless somebody ends up dying. But, I've personally seen it. Is that one of the things that you guys deal with once in a while?
That's number 2 on our list, actually. Just the way it worked out, a suspicious package worked out to be number 1. It happens all the time. The odds of it being, something severe like a bomb are very low, but the event happens a lot and the consequences are huge. But the domestic scenario of various types, whether it's a child custody issue or a squabble or a restraining order, we have and do face these things.
Yeah.
It's going to happen when you have that many people together. So you better prepare for it.
So you guys focus heavily on things like de-escalation and maybe trying to get them outside away from the other group?
Yeah, we do. And you know what? That brings up another really good point. I think a key decision that each church needs to make right off the bat is, what is your overall posture, right? Ours is, we've chosen to be very, very defensive in nature. And what I mean by that is our safety team, we're not going to lay hands on somebody unless there is imminent bodily harm, serious harm, right? Period. If somebody stands up in the middle of our service and starts reading from the book of Fred, we're going to let him do that. Sure, I'll walk up to him and I'll say, "Hey, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Can you step outside so I can hear you better? I really want to understand." But if he doesn't, we'll pause the service for 10 minutes until somebody in a uniform can get there and deal with the situation. We're just not going
exactly.
there. So I kind of like to, our posture is much more analogous to if you and your wife were at a restaurant one night, at what point would you get involved, right? Mm-hmm. If you see somebody stealing a fork, I doubt maybe you would, but I doubt you're going to go flying across the table and tackle them and cuff them, right?
Well, there was a time, but I'm older and wiser.
But, it kind of illustrates the point I'm trying to make is you need to make that decision. Now, other churches that might have more threats or, more opposition, so to speak, they might have to take a more proactive approach, to escorting people out of the premises and that kind of thing. So it's important to really think through that stuff in advance and build your response and your training around that.
And, that's what people need to understand is you really do have to work all this stuff out way ahead of time, because if something is not handled the way that other people might think it is, or there's negative feedback, or there's public backlash. If everybody's singing off the same sheet of music and everybody understands why you did what you did, and there's policies that back it up and your administration backs it up because it was within policy, it makes it so much easier. But if things are kind of done off the cuff, it devolves, and that's probably the number one reason why church security teams, safety teams go away.
Yeah. And you know what? Earlier you brought up the concept of, how do you quote unquote sell this to leadership? And our posture is actually, our defensive posture is actually a key point of that. I mean, we're a church. Unusual or disturbed or troubled individuals need to be there. We want them there.
Good point.
We just need to make sure that others are safe. So part of our act of service, so to speak, is one of us will volunteer. If there's somebody that looks off, doesn't look right, little disturbed, we're not going to turn them away. We want them there, but we will plant somebody behind them just to ensure the safety of others.
Yeah. And that sounds very similar to what happened in Texas. Unfortunately, this guy, he acted and they had to react, but at least they reacted as best they could given the cards they were dealt.
Yeah. And that's a good point. I don't want to second guess anything that happened there, because we have no idea what happened in the parking lot or when this guy was spotted, or, I don't have that information. But one thing that I would emphasize to anybody starting an initiative like this is to focus your efforts outside the doors.
Yeah.
We put, 60% of our resource at the doors looking outward. So we want to spot and greet those individuals that don't look right outside of the sanctuary.
And in the just couple minutes we have left here on this quick hit, can you think of any other pitfalls that you would have liked to known going into this, a couple of years ago? Anything that, might seem obvious now, but back then you kind of glossed over it when things were getting rolling?
Yeah, I think, one thing that comes to mind is the importance of team coordination. And we've gotten really good at that. But in the early days, you have the natural human tendencies to overcome. These people are volunteers and they want to help. So when a call would go out over a radio for a suspicious individual or anything for that matter, you'd have 10 volunteers flocking to the scene, right?
Yeah.
That's not good.
Yeah. Yep.
One of the things we've learned as we've gone is the importance of remaining on station. Now, all you law enforcement and military folks know this, but when you get volunteers together, we have to kind of relearn some of these things. So
exactly. We call it the pack mentality in law enforcement, and we've all been guilty of it, but you don't need 15 guys on top of the guy that's resisting, Well,
it's actually dangerous. If something's happening at the front door, the back door is wide open, if everybody flocks to the front door. So we've kind of learned the importance of acting as a team and making the hard choice sometimes to stay back and keep an eye on your area of responsibility. So. But
it's obviously very fulfilling for you.
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, it's a humble and sometimes thankless job. But you know what? There are lots of blessings in it too. I get to meet a lot of people. So, I like to tell our team that anybody who walks in the door that doesn't know us should assume we're a greeter. Mm-hmm. Says, hey, what do you think that person does here? Oh, they're a greeter. Perfect. That means we're doing our job.
Well, Tom McHale, thanks for giving us just some real quick tips on getting a church security team started and the care and feeding thereof. I really think this has struck such a chord with folks that we're going to do this some more, and you've got a lot of valuable experience that you can add as a working member of a team. So I would like to say thank you for listening to this quick hit episode of the Guns Magazine podcast. If you have comments or questions, please send me an email. That's editor@gunsmagazine.com. Remember, you can listen to us at gunsmagazine.com in the podcast tab or subscribe to us at your favorite podcast directory. While you're at it, don't forget to also check out American Handgunner magazine at americanhandgunner.com. Whatever you do, please tell all your friends, even the liberals. On behalf of Tom McHale, I'm Guns Magazine editor Brent Wheat. Now get out there and get shooting.